right, thank you, Kelly. So what I want to talk to you about today is what we've been at Blink talking about as being sort of a human-centered UX research approach. And some of, I think for myself, where this conversation begins, it comes back to trying to reconcile some of the differences between my some of the work I did several years ago as sort of an academic researcher and studying learning sciences or sort of the design of learning technologies and how people learn in real settings and so forth, and then coming in and working in a UX research field. So what I currently do at Blink is I'm a UX researcher, and so I tend to work with clients on user interface problems or sort of broader user research sorts of things. I think probably the best way, or the way I'd like to, whether this is the best way or not, the way I'd like to get into this conversation is to tell you a story about Sally. And Sally was a participant that we had in a research study that we were doing, maybe a year and a half ago or something like that. And Sally had recently moved to the Seattle area. And so she had sort of picked up on that, like in many places, there are sort of certain kinds of local type cultural practices and things like that. And she wanted to learn to adopt those. So you might imagine if you had moved to Tokyo or something like that and you wanted to learn about manga, for example, or which is sort of a form of Japanese cartoons, or if you had moved to the southeast United States and wanted to get into watching SEC football. There are certain kinds of things and language and so forth that go on with that. And the way that this sort of ties into the study that we were doing is it was for Starbucks. Starbucks is a great client of ours. We do a lot of work with them. And in particular, we were looking at their mobile application, okay? And most of the mobile application people use for paying at the register and so forth. But what Sally had done is she had sort of wanted to learn as she came to Seattle how to order her coffee correctly and sort of adopt this persona of being the sort of prototypical latte drinker and so forth. And so what she did is the mobile application actually has a digital menu in it. So she went in, and this is like the only person in the study who really had used the digital menu. She had gone in there and picked out her favorite drinks and saved them and would bring them up before she walked into the store and practiced saying them, okay? And so she learned sort of how to correctly order the drink. And so she got to the point where she could say very quickly something like grande light ice, 1 pump classic latte. And she had about 5 of these drinks that she showed me that she had done with this. And so for her, this really helped her feel at home in this new place. I think she had said she moved here from Texas or something like that. And so it really helped her kind of adopt this sort of Northwest persona. Part of the reason I find this interesting is that we have this, a mobile app and a digital menu, but we also have embedded in it sort of a distributed knowledge system between Sally and the application, and we have a learning device that comes out of this, where she's sort of, and not learning in necessarily a knowledge sense, but also in the sense that she's sort of adopting a new identity, she's able to describe herself in a different kind of way. And what I think this story articulates in a very, very kind of small way is what I've been calling the promise. And I think the promise is a little bit of why many of us work in this field and why we think this field is important and why we come to conferences and we achieve to do great work in our deliverables and so forth. And that promise is that technology will make life better. And so in Sally's case, this technology helped her feel at home in a new place and helped her sort of transition her life in some way, okay? Now, I like to think of this term promise in 2 ways. There's, first of all, hope, right? There's the hope that what we're building actually does make people's lives better, and in some instances, it actually may not. There's also the sense of a contract, okay? And a contract in the sense between us and the user. People entrust with us lots of things. They entrust with us their money, on the one hand, also their time, their energy, in many cases their privacy, and so forth. Okay, and so if you think about the entire tech industry and everybody that's involved in it, we are the promise keepers. We are the ones who are the most responsible for keeping that promise with our users, for making sure that technology does make their lives better. And, you know, I think that the clients that we've been working with increasingly are sort of recognizing this challenge and are coming to us with problems and things that they want to do with their products and their customers that really do want to make people's lives better. So we have clients who are looking for ways to inspire writing, for example, or to really help people quit smoking or adopt a healthy lifestyle in some way. We have another client who is building sort of devices and so forth to help people drive better, safer, and more fuel efficient and so forth. We have another client by the name of School of Life, and they have a system that they set up in schools that sort of interviews kids and has them sort of document their lives at various stages throughout their life with the hope that they're going to gain self-knowledge and perspective, right? So that they have a better understanding of who they are, so they fundamentally change themselves in some way. These are really sort of big, big goals. And I think if you look at something like the quantified self, the industry has this hope that, you know, by attaching devices to people or tracking them in certain ways, that we can really sort of help them achieve something that they wouldn't otherwise be able to achieve with the technology. The problem for UX, though, is that the concepts that we've relied on, and in addition the methods that we often derive from those, are not well suited to understanding how people change and how people learn and how people adapt over time. These concepts are, for the most part, about the technology. And in fact, if we tried to apply them to people, it may get quite comical at times. If you think about somebody being usable or desirable, that's not really something that I think that we would think of as being productive in achieving in designs that help make people's lives better. So, in essence, these things are really focused on the design and not the human side of things. So what I want to do is sort of start from where I see the beginning of trying to add to these concepts things that we can use both in terms of concepts and some methodological kinds of things in order to help us sort of make UX research a little more human-centered. So I want to begin with sort of three things here, and that's people, practices, and context, and unpack those as we go through. So I'll start with unpack how we can think about how these things change as a result of people using what we make. So for people, looking into something like identity, emotion, knowledge, how is what we are using changing people's emotional states? How is it changing their identity? In the case of Sally, we see an example of how it changes, the use of a digital menu shifts how she thinks about who she is and the context she lives in. It also changes her knowledge. She knows something about the correct syntax of how to order a coffee drink in a particular location. Very simple example, but you can extend this out to something like School of Life, where you have young people and gaining self-perspective on who they are in the world, and this ends up sort of extrapolating out in some really profound ways. We also look at practices, and by practices, I'm sort of borrowing from some kind of sociological terms, but really what I'm talking about are sort of what are people doing as they're going about their daily lives? What are their routines and habits? And how do these change over time as a result of using our various devices and so forth? I'm sure many of you think about something like what your life was like before having mobile devices or a smartphone, and you've adopted new routines around those that have changed how you communicate with the people around you, how you do the work that you do, and so forth. We also have the methods of work. What are the strategies that people have for sort of accomplishing things on a moment-to-moment basis? Technology changes those in some ways as well. In terms of context, how are the materials and the ecosystems that people create around themselves changing as a result of what we're making and designing? How are the social relationships that people have shifting over time as well. So one way to think about this is as sort of a pathway that people go through in their lives and that their technology goes through as well that sort of change over time. I have an example from a study that my colleague, Nika Smith-Auld, who's, I don't know if she's in the room here, but she's at the conference. She did, I don't know, maybe 2012, so a little over a year ago or so, a year and a half ago, on people's first use with Siri. So she was studying people and how they adopted Siri over the first month. So these were people who had just bought an iPhone and were getting used to using the voice assistant that many of us have seen become familiar with. And one of the things she found is that they sort of go through a particular kind of pathway with this. So there's an initial excitement that they have. Hey, this is great. I got this new device. I'm ready to try it out. I just shelled out $400 or $500, or $200 or $300 for my iPhone, new contract. There's an optimistic curiosity as they go into it. I wonder what kinds of things I can get it to say. Can I get Siri to say something offensive? Can I tell her she's ugly? Can I tell her she's beautiful? This kind of thing. Right? So they sort of go through these kinds of stages. And then they try to maybe use it in a functional way, and they get a little frustrated. Siri's not understanding what they're saying, giving them directions to the wrong place, this kind of thing. So there's this sort of frustrated stage. And finally, there's an acceptance of it and a habit formation of how they're going to adopt and use this in their daily lives. What we see, though, is that in addition to the kinds of typical UX concepts, we have things like emotion and routine, which play into the overall use, habit formation, and so forth of this technology and how it changes people. Ultimately, I think one of the things we're going to have to do as a field is when we think about how we structure usability sessions and our study designs and so forth, we typically begin with tasks. What do we want people to do? I think we're going to need to adopt and add in routines and thinking about what are people's routines as they go out throughout their lives, and how is what we're building fitting into that, adapting it, and so forth. Some of this is going to take some work to a bit of sort of pre-ethnographic type work to understanding it, but also some design work, which I'll kind of explain on how we might get into sort of studying the changes in that. As far as unpacking routines by stage, thinking about what are the jobs that people are trying to get done in their routine? What are they trying to accomplish through it? What are the tools that they're using? What kinds of other devices do they have that fit into this? And who are the people that are around them that are helping them out with this? As I go through this, I like to think about, back to sort of my previous work that I was doing. When I first came to this field, I sort of thought of these two things as being very similar, but as I've reflected, I've seen them as quite different, and that is design research versus what in the learning sciences community, or some people who are developing various kinds of learning technologies, think of as being design-based research. I'll start here with design research just to sort of have a grounding of what I'm talking about, and that is research that is embedded into the design process, okay? So in this sense, we often go out and we collect some evidence about how people use something and then feed it into the design. So some of this might be, is it usable? What are the kinds of use cases that we're going to think about with it? And we apply our UX concepts in order to improve our design over time. Design-based research actually thinks of design as a kind of research methodology. So it becomes sort of, there's really very little separation between design and research in this sense. They're not really separated. What you do is you start out with an explanatory theory about something. So in the cases that we were working with, it was often about how kids learn something like science. So you might be trying to investigate, for example, how do you use inquiry techniques for learning science? And so you would think about what goes into somebody coming to understand something like how light moves or something like that. And you sort of build a theory of that, and then you design something that's going to help them learn that over time, and you implement it through real-world cases, and then you see how that works, and you refine your theory over time. And you refine your theory based on the implementation, and then you go back and you refine your design. This is really well suited for understanding how technology impacts change in people, what they're doing, and the context. How does what we're putting into this classroom, for example, change the kids in this context? How does it help them change their understanding of something like, how light moves or other various kinds of scientific concepts? It also is something that you can look at for understanding how does it change the way that kids go about understanding what science is and how people do science, for example. So what I like to think about is how we might apply this to something like adopting healthy behaviors. So this is something that people are often very interested in with something like I mentioned with the quantified self and so forth. So you'd begin with a theory of behavior change, okay? So for example, you might have something, you borrow, either go out and sort of do your own work and talking with people who are looking to change the way they eat or have gone through that process recently and unpack what was it that sort of led to that, what were the things that they did in that regard, and then sort of develop this theory about it. So one thing might be that people often have a trigger of some sort, and there are people like B.J. Fogg who does a lot of research on behavior change and so forth that you can fold into this theory. And then you design for it, and you design around the change in the people, the practices, and the context, okay? And then implement it, put it out there and see how it works. Does it then end up changing people, the practices that they're doing and the context that they live in? Are they actually living healthier lives based on this? Feeding back into our sense of, is this actually making their lives better in some way? Okay, as I think about this then, I don't necessarily think about these as the UX concepts and methods that we had previously as being separate, but this is sort of being in addition to it in some way, an additive process. And that's it. I'll open up to questions now. No questions? Yeah. Sure. So I think if I sort of drew from the example of Sally, so and that wasn't really a design-based research study, but it was a very typical kind of design research thing where we were just trying to understand, some of what works well with maybe the menu process or some other aspects of it. I think with a design-based research thing, we would ask different questions of these people about, how does coffee fit into their life and so forth, and how does this change over time, for example. So that's sort of one way that I would see it being applied in a product sense. The kinds of education products that we were working on, I would call them products in that they weren't really sold. They were sort of out of an academic research thing, but they were intended to be sort of used across multiple people or in wide contexts. We would begin with maybe a theory of, how people interact with something. So it might be a system for recording somebody doing something and then explaining a layer over it, right? And so there's some sense of that people need to have sort of additive layers to it and so forth. And then it sort of gets put out into a context, and you have some idea of like, oh, it's going to need to be, for example, having somebody sit by it or something like that. And what you end up seeing is that people sort of use it in ways that kind of come unexpected, and that they end up adapting, maybe there's some certain other features or something like that come along with it. Yeah.
I had a question, or wanted to dive in a little deeper into the idea of tasks versus routine.
Yeah.
And the question I had was, do you think testing methodologies need to evolve? Because right now it seems like a lot of UX testing is, as you suggested, very task-based.
Yeah.
But a testing environment is very different than an everyday routine.
Sure.
So is the idea that testing itself needs to evolve to fit into everyday routines?
I think that's right. And, when I say evolve, I don't know that we're there yet and we have it all worked out. I certainly don't think we do, but that's exactly right. And whether that means embedding things in people's homes and sort of seeing how it adapts, or asking people, or sort of having a session set up in a way that's more free-flowing, where you ask people to recreate what they do, sort of over, have the right set of materials there that you're sort of recreating in a much messier kind of way versus kind of a clean task base. We just have the site here, you're sitting here, go through and see if you can purchase it. Like, let's talk about what goes on, for example, when someone's deciding whether or not to buy a tablet or something like that. Like, who are all the people that you wrap into this decision? What are your considerations? What's your routine for going about? Or I wouldn't say routine to them, but what's your process for going about deciding whether you want to buy a product? And let's try to recreate this over time and see how, if we're going to adapt and change the flow in some way or something like that, how that's going to change what you're doing. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm trying to pull a question here, just starting with Don Norman's talk. So he's talking there about researchers being at times too academic,
Mm-hmm.
and not thinking about shipping products.
Sure.
And the only thing the business cares about is not even shipping the product, it's shipping the product and kind of making money. If I feel like you're indexing more to the human side, how do you sort of suggest bringing those, if they are opposites, like where's the conversion point?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think that design-based research actually, as a history, evolved out of trying to move from very sort of academic ways of thinking about learning into sort of more contextual, real-world ways of thinking about learning. So there's some well-known developmental psychologists who had spent their life working in labs, for example, studying, very sort of nuanced things about either animals or, nuanced things about how kids learn literature, and realizing that they were sort of really disconnected from what was happening in the classroom and wanting to test their ideas and build something that would actually work in a classroom. And so I think that in some respects, this thinking about the way that community evolved could help this community evolve in some ways towards bridging that kind of gap that Donald Norman was talking about, where imagine, he's talking about somebody building something in Lisp that only works with the guy standing next to it. Well, it's not that far to sort of build something that you have in a kind of certain sets of test environments and so forth that people are evolving. And that test environment may actually be the market. I know that's a little dangerous, and people often are very hesitant to put things out there, but it may be there may be some ways to do it in that regard. And everyone's probably really hungry at this point.
I do have a question. Can you give a sense of scale as far as time frame?
Yeah, so, I mean, in an academic context, design-based research is something that people work on for years, and that's, I think, to their own detriment. I think it's something that could be done a lot quicker and maybe even built into something like an agile process, for example, where you're sort of building things over time and you're iterating. Timescale, I think it depends to some extent on how fast you can build something that you can get in front of people to use based on your theory. And it doesn't obviously have to be a complete product in some way. That obviously varies based on whether it's a site or, that kind of thing. Yeah?
Can you give a concrete example of a really big change of approach that came through considering your routine versus a set of tasks?
That's a good question. I have to let me think about that for a second. So I think that, for example, I don't know that for me it's necessarily that I've structured a session differently, but as I've sort of analyzed what people are telling me. So in the case of inspiring writing, having people come to a site and really sort of beginning the session by talking with them about what their writing process is at this point and how they sort of come to understand where they maybe want to publish or what they want to write or so forth, and then watching, putting the site in front of them and watching how that sort of changes their sense of what they could write and what they couldn't write, and so how that might adapt their routine over time in that sense. So it's been, for me at this point, more sort of post-looking back and saying, hey, there's an opportunity here to really shift where they think they're going to go do something at, right? Versus at this point, I have this routine. So that's one example. Another one I have is where I've done sort of pre-product research, and I've gone through and asking people about sort of productivity and maybe a personal project, and then document it out over in almost kind of, if you're familiar with experience maps, in a similar kind of format to that, where you have, hey, here's what somebody's trying to accomplish. They're trying to be, save money on their groceries, for example. And here's their routine for doing that every week, and sort of documenting that out and saying, and then there's a whole bunch of pieces that fall into this and where there might be opportunities to help them improve in that process or organize their life in some way.
So both of those examples are really about helping people modify their routine for the better?
Yeah.
Is that more what you're talking about than understanding the routine and crafting an experience around that routine?
I think that's sort of more what I'm talking about, but I'm not certain that the other wouldn't. And when you say understanding the experience, are you saying create a new experience in that sense?
Well, if say your project has to do with, I don't know, some sort of business, line of business application where you're tracking things, and you understand the routine of the person who uses it, you would craft that experience around. These are the things that are, perhaps important at 8 a.m. and no longer important at 4 p.m. I don't know.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't be trying to change their routine. You're trying to serve their routine.
Trying to serve their routine. I think that's probably an equally, yeah. So you're trying, but even by sort of improving, not necessarily changing it, but make it more efficient or something like that. Is that what you're suggesting?
I guess.
Yeah. So I think that would be fine. Yeah, I think that would be a useful way to think about it. Did you have your hand up? No. Yeah.
I had one question. You touched briefly on it. So we've just started this agile process. So we're doing weekly testing now where we're looking at a specific feature or a specific part of the page. But as a researcher, I feel like the overall experience is lost a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for how to incorporate some of that design-based research within some of these user sessions that we're running?
Yeah. So is it? That's a good question. So is it that you only have access to the one page at a time, or is it just that that's all that this particular session is focused on, or this week is only focused?
So we have our different product teams, and now we have users coming in once a week. And each product team is actually leading their own session, so they'll just be testing whatever prototype they've developed.
I see.
Which also causes some problems too.
Yeah. So it's kind of used out of context of the entire product in that sense. Yeah. That can be problematic if you have something, if changes in one thing it may affect changes in the other part of it. So I don't know that I'd have to sort of look at the specific context, but I would recommend thinking about, at least as part of every session, having some sorts of things on, thanks, Joe, having some way of thinking about the entire experience with the product. So oftentimes, we'll sort of pull that out at the beginning or at the end and, sort of ask people sort of about their sort of typical experiences and so forth and work from it in that kind of context. Does that help in some way?
Yeah, that helps. We're doing some background questions up front.
Yeah.
But with the designers leading the session sometimes, I think they get really caught up in the design versus design for the experience.
Yeah, too bogged down. So, sometimes having some whole team work on it kinds of things can help with that. Other questions? Okay, I think we're about out of time.